is absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome you here tonight to the Faculty of Education. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that tonight we are gathering here together on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We are so blessed to be in this building, this place that has been a place of learning since time immemorial. And we really want to acknowledge and pay our respects to the incredible wisdom that our First Nations people have shared with us, to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and indeed to extend that to any Indigenous people joining us here tonight. We often talk about in our faculty that our First Nations people are our first teachers, and tonight I think it's even more important to acknowledge the incredible place that their wisdom has in the academy, and particularly the deep understanding and education that they provide us around deep interconnectedness and how important that is in education today. I'm absolutely delighted tonight to be welcoming a very special guest who is dear to my heart as well. We have a wonderful visiting scholar from MIT Systems Awareness Lab, Dr. Mette Miriam. I know you said it, back to front, Mette. So we're welcoming Dr. Mette Miriam Boell tonight. Mette and I have had the great opportunity to be working together over the last number of years, and it is such a great opportunity to be able to bring her out here tonight to share some of the great work that they have been doing over at MIT. So for those of you who I haven't had the privilege of meeting before, my name is Rachel Colla, and I'm a senior lecturer here in the Centre for Wellbeing Science. I also hold a teaching and learning innovation role here at the Faculty of Education, and I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to some of our distinguished guests, including our Dean, Professor Jim Watterston. We're delighted to have you here with us tonight, Jim. Jim was sharing with me at the beginning of tonight that he's here not as a Dean, but actually out of his own intellectual curiosity. So it's fabulous to be able to have you here tonight, Jim. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Dianne Vella-Brodrick, who is the Director of our Centre for Wellbeing Science. And Dianne will actually be concluding this evening and sharing a lovely thank you for our guest. So tonight's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Mette Miriam Boell. Mette is the co-founder of the MIT Systems Awareness Lab and the Centre for Systems Awareness with Dr. Peter Senge. I've had the great pleasure of working with both Mette and Peter over the last 5 years as part of a global community of educators that have really been working towards looking at how we can evolve our education systems to really enable hope for our future. And never has that been more important. One of Mette's great strengths is the incredible transdisciplinary background that she brings to this work. She, by training, is a biologist who has specialised in complex social systems. We heard this afternoon when she came to visit us that her PhD was in organisational ethology, and she also holds additional degrees in contemplative leadership and in the history and philosophy of science. Over the last decade, this disciplinary richness has now been brought to education, and I think that's one of the real insights that we'll gain from tonight is the great opportunity to be able to learn from a variety of different disciplinary lenses how we can be looking at our own education systems through a bit of a different lens. In 2014, Mette joined Peter Senge and Daniel Goleman, who I'm sure might be familiar names to many of you here tonight, to form the Triple Focus Initiative. And their work really focused on integrative learning. They focused on exploring the impact of integrating contemplative, social and emotional learning together with systems thinking in education. In 2018, Mette joined MIT as a visiting scholar, and she has not left. So she now splits her time between Denmark and the USA. Through their work there, they've been able to convene a global community of collaborators for sustainable, high-impact transformation in education. And this has happened not just through research, but through policy, pedagogy, and practice. They have worked with state education systems, both in the United States and in Canada as well. They've worked with universities, with school districts, with individual schools and educational leaders right across the globe. Mette's work is grounded in the core belief that education today must help students to recognise and navigate the increasingly complex world that we are facing. A world that is being shaped by profound interconnectedness, something that we certainly became aware of in the last number of years. And that's a world that we need to really be able to appreciate how we turn our attention to some of the broader interconnected systems, be they ourself, understood as the mind, body, heart system, the other, families, friends, teams and groups, and the larger social, economic and natural systems around us. I'd like to now invite you to join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Mette to deliver her guest lecture this evening.
Thank you for this beautiful introduction. As Rachel said, I have this dual role of being the CEO and executive director at the Center for Systems Awareness, which is a nonprofit through which we've been able to work with amazing, caring people across the globe who are all in the field of education or beyond the field of education, some are as well, but all come into the work with a kind of a profound sense of care for our children. And we're many, I think, probably shared by many of you in this space who have deep concerns about the declining mental health and well-being for our children everywhere in the world. And it is really everywhere in the world, at least all the places I go to visit, that is the primary concern that people bring up. Our kids are not thriving. And I have a lot to say about this, but it's also my primary motivation for being in this line of work. A couple of years ago, after we had this opportunity to grow what we call the Compassionate Systems Framework, which is a framework that works across the system of education, and one little thing that you didn't get to mention, Rachel, was we also actually work directly with students, which is my favorite part of the work. We have a youth leadership team at the center that works directly with the younglings, and it's a lot more efficient when young, cool guys go into the room and talk about why, you should learn about complexity and practice meditation and so on than if I go into the room, because I'm just another old lady talking at you. But our guys are, they do parkour and they are really cool and, stuff like that. So that kind of really works. And the outcomes for the kids is extremely rewarding because they become empowered. One of our younglings in California recently shared, we brought her into a setting full of adults, as we often do. She was 15 at the time. And she said, this is the first time where I've always been the student voice, the candidate that speaks up on behalf of the other kids. But this is the first time that I had the training that all the adults in the room have as well. I've been through the same training. I know the work well. I know the language. I know the tools and strategies. I can now be here not as a token gesture, but be here as an equal partner in shaping what needs to happen with our education system. So that's really our motivation for working with the young people. And it's incredibly rewarding being able to do so. So I have a little bit of a thing. I'm going to try to balance the pace. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. I'm well aware that we have a limited amount of time. And at the same time, I would like to just be able to give you just enough so that it makes sense what I'm talking about and doesn't just become a huge abstraction. So questions are always welcome. Even if they're clarifying questions while I'm speaking, that's okay too. I'd rather have an informal setting where we can kind of explore this together. And otherwise, by the end of it, if you have some questions that you would like to ask, write them down or hold them, and then we can, I would prefer for you all to write it down. I don't know about you, but if I'm holding a question, it's really hard for me to pay attention to whatever else is going on. So putting it on paper, and then we can come back to it afterwards and make sure that there is a little bit of time to also address whatever might come up for you during this. Sounds okay? All right. So my whole thing, as Rachel was sharing, I was a biologist originally, and I come into this work with a profound love of nature. I find living systems to be the most intriguing and interesting thing in the world. And the more I've worked with humans, I started out studying animals, and they're fluffy and fun, and they don't talk, and there's all kinds of great things to say about that. And you all have marsupials. Evolution took a turn here and was like, let's try out how it works with these marsupials. I think that's so fascinating. I've been out looking at them when I've been here, and I even got to pet a kangaroo at one point, which was a really big thing for me. So, but you know, working with humans as part of living systems is really one of the things that we're trying to do here, because we, the humans, are in fact part of the living system of this world. And it seems to me that we've by and large forgotten, and the unintended side effects of forgetting what it means to be part of a living system in a, you know, in an ecosystem that's profoundly interconnected. We're suffering a lot of consequences of forgetting that, which just over the last couple of 100 years has been kind of cast aside with all of the great developments of science and industries and so on. And I think, I mean, one thing that occurred to me when I started doing all this work in education, which was not a given match for me. I didn't think I would work in education, but I'll always side with the kids, so maybe it's a good place to be. So the reason why we're working in education is, one, it is by far the highest leverage if we want to change societal structures, because kids don't have to unlearn all the. How are you all about swearing in this country? There's a swear word sitting right here. Let's just put it that way. Kids don't have to unlearn all of that if they learn the right things from the beginning. Something about what it means to be a human being in an interconnected system, and what it means to show up in a way where you're participating with generosity of spirit into the fields that you're part of and all that. And most of us have to unlearn most of our learnings throughout time, particularly those of us who've grown up in academia as I have. There's just a lot of things that we have to unlearn in order to be able to show up with that level of integrity and authenticity. Relearning how to human. Kids actually know that, and then we beat it out of them during their education. And now we're, you know, middle-aged, and then we have to kind of try to relearn what that means. So it is by far the highest leverage, and also, of course, with the longitudinal part of it, that that's the 75-year plan instead of starting working with people when they're my age or older. So that's the one thing. And of course, the primary thing is that this cry for help, I consider it a feedback from the system that we, the human species, are the only species where our young ones are taking their own lives. And they do that increasingly. Everywhere where we work. They're stressed, they're depressed, they're disconnected, they have no idea what to do. And people try to blame it on social media. This was not about social media. Social media wouldn't hold the attraction that it does if we knew how to human well. So, I have grandchildren. And children, of course, but I have such deep concern about the state of the world. I have deep concerns about what we're going to do when that's the common denominator, that everywhere I go, in all the many, many countries that I get to go to, that's the number one issue people bring up. So living systems change holds for me, you know, a kind of a dual meaning. One is that, yes, we are part of these living systems, and mostly when we talk about systems change, we forget to take into account that we're really an organic species living in an organic system, and that has to be taken into account. But the other thing is that we actually have to live the systems change that we want to be part of, or that we want to see in the world. And that is part of the kind of the novelty of this work, and probably why it resonates with so many people, because there are ways in which we can live differently that start shaping the systems around us in a different way. So, a fundamental principle in systems thinking is structure shapes behavior. I like that. It's very basic, and it basically means that when I'm standing here, it's a particular structure that most of us share in this space. My arm bends really well this way, and it doesn't really bend very well the other way, not unless it causes me a lot of pain, and then it's not particularly functional. And that's a particular structure that produces a particular behavior. I can carry things, I can open things, I can do stuff. My opposable thumb can make me, touch each other, and so on and so forth. Those are structures that produces particular outcomes. If it could bend in all directions, it would be like an amoeba form, and it wouldn't be, of much use to anything. If my knees could bend in all directions, I wouldn't be able to walk, for example. So structure shapes behavior is not just a nice idea, it's also a very kind of practical implication of systems thinking. So the structures in place are always shaping the outcomes that we see. Mostly when I talk to people in different places, they say, oh, the system of education is broken. And I'm like, no, it's not. It was designed to produce exactly the outcomes that it's producing. The structure in place is producing these outcomes. If we want to see a different system of education, we have to redesign the structure. That's what systems change is all about. And for us, it has to be compassionate. I don't really care about redesigning a good idea. I want the feelings and the emotions of what it means to be a human being in an interconnected world where we care for our children to be at the forefront of how we're redesigning that structure. That's a very unacademic thing to say, of course, but I still hold to it though. So part of what that means is when we talk about what we talk about in our line of work, we talk about the underlying structure producing these outcomes, consistently kind of generating the outcomes that we see. The underlying structure is composed of mental models on the one hand. Can I point with this one? No? No. Okay, so mental models on the one hand, so everything we bring to the table, our conditioning, our biases, how we habitually think and feel about things, our cultural kind of imprinting, the way we learn that that's just the way how things are, our emotions, our, the whole way in which we operate. Most of it blind spot, the lenses through which we're seeing the world, most of it is, totally unconscious to us. That's why traveling is really healthy when you're young, because you discover, oh, people do things really differently here, and that seems to also work for them. So it expands our horizon. That's basically because it kind of fertilizes our mental models, so we hold them a little less rigidly. So that's the one thing. But then, of course, the artifacts are also shaping the mental models. And the artifacts are the physical manifestations of how we think about things. Churchill said it beautifully. He said, first we shape the walls, and then the walls shape us. So first we put in place a system of education. It's made for factory workers. There has to be a bell that rings. It's every 45 or 50 minutes, and then you have to change to something else. And the drill, kids in line, teacher in front of the classroom, and so on and so forth. That's a mental model that people hold about education. It was never designed for human flourishing. And yet we're consistently trying to add things into it as if we can create human flourishing in a structure that wasn't designed for that purpose at all, instead of thinking about how we can redesign the structure. That is why we need systems thinking. So I want to just kind of go over the ecosystem of education. And I hold the right to have a little bit of arrogance when people talk about ecosystems in general, because I am a biologist after all. And mostly when people talk about ecosystems, it's like 3 things, and then it's the ecosystem. And like, have you ever talked to anybody who knows stuff about soil? Or, it's just a lot more, there's a lot more complexity to it. But, from a kind of a systems perspective, when we talk about the ecosystem of education, then, we have society and families. And then the families, many of them are parents, and they have children, and the children become the students, and the teachers are part of, that whole part of the education system, but they're also part of the families. These are causal loop diagrams. They're in the classrooms. The classroom forms the schools. The schools have out of school, and they're formed by the district. And, then in the US at least, and in some countries, I think you have regions here. And you seem to have less layers to the systems, which can be a really good thing and can also be a really messy thing, depending on how informed people are about how all these things goes on. And then there's state or country or province-wide. We have philanthropy and a mix of it in many, many places where all of a sudden somebody thinks that something is a great idea. For example, Bill Gates. I don't know about you all, but at one point he found out that he saw a school that worked really well. It was a charter school, and all of a sudden the Gates Foundation gave an immense amount of funding to charter schools, and it basically broke up the entirety of the public school system in the United States, formed a tremendous amount of charter schools, some of which are extremely well functioning and some of which are really not. But it just caused a lot of disconnect in the other end because there was a lack of kind of systems understanding of the system of education by and large. So that's one role philanthropy can play. Of course, sometimes I've had the great privilege of having private funders and just who, you know, I believe in you and this is what you should do, and I'm not, you know what you're doing. My part of this is partnering with you for the funding. Those are the philanthropists that I love because it's just lovely being in partnership with people who can bring energy in a different way into creating these changes. So these are all feedback loops, and even though they're non-linear, they're still a mechanistic understanding. So when we look at an ecosystem like this, we've kind of got some of it covered at least, and we can see that, okay, this already brings a lot of complexity. But the whole living part of it, we kind of forget. Because first and foremost, the system of education is one of the most rigid systems we can imagine because it is intergenerational. Everybody went to school. That means that everybody has a really integrated, ingrained mental model about what school is supposed to be. I bet you if you ask most people on this planet, it's still kids in rows, teacher in front, filling empty vessels. You have to learn math and science and be some kind of literacy. It's not supposed to be fun, and there is homework, and that's okay, and so on and so forth. It is a really ingrained mental model about what education is, and it's intergenerational. Most people never had fun when they went to school, so it's okay that you're not having fun either, my child or next in line, because that's just what it is. That's just how education works. So it's intergenerational. And then it's emotionally nested. It means that all of us bring our emotional attention to the space in different ways. None of us feel the same way about being in school. The parents feel differently. They feel differently about each of their children. The children in the classroom feel differently about the students, the teachers. They feel differently about the students and the teachers. The teachers, of course, feel very differently about each of the different students and so on. So there's just so many layers of emotionality, most of it totally unattended to because we forgot that emotional literacy is a core premise of living a functional and human, flourishing human life. So all of this goes unnoticed, and I can tell you that, for example, this is basically mapping the elements of the system in California, where we've worked statewide for the last 7 years, mainly because people don't really know about systems. The emotions become how they relate to each other. So nobody likes the State Department. The State Department and the county offices are supposed to work together, and there's, by and large, a lot of distrust. There's also a State Board of Education that doesn't actually trust the State Department, so the State Board of Education has initiated another entity that's supposedly a non-for-profit, but has gotten all the funding that they think is needed to yada, 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 yada. What this creates is emotional toxicity. They're out to get me. It has to be extremely transactional for people to work together. It's really opaque where the boundary conditions are, who's responsible for what, and so on and so forth. So there's just such dysfunctionality and people shaming and blaming each other across the hierarchies of the system. And who do you think lose out on that? The kids. If this is the dysfunctional patterns that eventually gets to the kids, of course, that's what they sit at the heart of. It is not a productive way of operating. And then there are layers of meaning. So not only do we have all this emotionality and so on and so forth, we also have different ways of understanding things, not just politically or religiously or so on and so forth, but also in the little everyday things. If you've ever received an email that really set you off in a negative way, has that ever happened to you where you're like, why did this person do that? and then you eventually get around to talking to that person and it came with a completely different intent than what you put into it, that happens all the time in all interactions. And we have such low relational literacy that we don't even know how to, connect with people around that and be like, this is how I received this. Was that what you intended? Because that can actually be solved as easily as all that. But most of us have very few of those conversations in our lives. So all of this is the messiness of a living system. And these are just, layers of it. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could add. But they are really the reasons why, great that we can have causal loop diagrams and talk about how the system is interdependent. But this is where, it becomes extremely hard to study what's going on. If we apply traditional methodologies upon trying to figure out what's going on in a system like this, we're missing out of all these layers because nobody knows how to study intergenerational trauma structures or intergenerational understanding. Nobody knows how to study this way that people are emotional about some things and then the next day it's something else and then this and then that. And nobody knows how to even begin to bring in the sense of meaning, the sense of belonging. What's my sense of purpose? How did that become meaningful to me in this instant and so on? We don't know how to do that. So that's why we need a kind of a science of living systems change, which might take a little while to fully land, but I'll introduce you at least to as far as we've gotten now. So these are what I'm trying to light up here in green, which is a very opaque green, but the teacher, student, classroom, school, out of school, which means expanded learning in the California lingo, district, county, and state, are the layers that we are able to now bring into what we call our site development work, where we actually have access to all those layers of the system, which is incredible. And of course, really rewarding being able to work across that. It's also led me to, I should say something about, it's also led me to understand that it's still not enough. So one thing that we tried to do was, okay, so if all of these layers of complexity have to do with living systems change, then how do we try to model the systems that we're looking at out of a living system? And so we looked to one of the most successful strategies in nature, which is mycelium. How many of you have watched the Fantastic Fungi movie on Netflix? Yeah, so this is a great time for talking about fungi. Mycelium is basically, if I'd done this 5 years ago, people would be like, what are you talking about? But now there's a little more awareness of the incredible richness that nature has produced in form of fungi. And it's an incredibly successful strategy. So basically, when we see a little mushroom, we think that's the fungi, but underneath it is something that resembles a neural network that is a distributed network. It works across ecosystems and into the very roots of trees, and it's a continuous exchange of nutrients and information. The trees and plants bring that into the fungi network, into the mycelium, and the mycelium bring whatever is needed into the trees and the ecosystems as well. So we thought this is a great model if we are to try to grow a global community of people who really are in support of and working towards compassionate systems change. This is the model that we can do that from. So we're prototyping it with our own Center for Systems Awareness. And I had a lot of fun developing these models, as you can probably tell. So if this is the fungi that I'm trying to point, you'll have to just follow my very insignificant pointer here. The fungi release spores, and the spores, I probably have words for it here. Hyphae begin to form, and the hyphae come together and shapes these mycelia. It's almost like a weave. It really does look like a neural network. And then they form primordiums that are kind of the quasi-fruit buddies. And the fruit buddies emerge again, and then that's the whole cycle. So what we've tried to do is model, so the Center for Systems Awareness, we can say, is the kind of the mother mushroom. And what we bring out into to this mycelium is ideas and information and generative nutrients. So we consistently try to be in communication and you know, we do a lot of capacity building and so on and so forth with people. And then the individual training, when people have gone through our kind of introductory workshops and so on, we can say that they become little threads that can weave into the global community. And so the global community is basically what our mycelium is. We have a year-long master practitioner program that Rachel is currently part of, and a lot of other Australians have been part of as well. And they're the primordiums. And when I first introduced this to our master practitioners one was like, I'm not a mushroom. And that just stands with me forever because clearly his desire was to grow into a mushroom. I'm like, you're right on the edge of becoming one, so we're good. And then the local hubs, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So it's really important for us that this is not a centralized thing. If we are to grow compassionate systems change as an alternative to the current conditions in the world, it has to be localized. And so what we're doing is we're growing local mushrooms. I really love the metaphor, so you'll have to bear with me. Right now, we're in the process of establishing our very first kind of mushroom in British Columbia, in our offshoot there, where we have the extraordinary opportunity to work with the Ministry of Science and the Ministry of Health, with all the districts in the province of British Columbia to bring this forth. And there's, you know, funding for it, ministry governance funding for doing that. And so that seems like a great place. We have about 35 master practitioners in the province, and our job is to support them to be able to lead the work on the ground. So this is not about us growing as an organization and you are now all dependent on us. On the contrary, my ambition for this work is that one day nobody will ever call me again because they can all do the work themselves. And one of the conversations I'm in here in Australia, and why I've come back this year, I was here last year as well, is because there's so much work growing here as well. And we are looking to see what it would take to grow a local mushroom in Victoria and potentially South Australia together, because a lot of the work is growing here as well. So that's the local hubs, and it's a kind of an exchange or interchange with the center at all times, so that we're collectively just really trying to bring this strengthening the mycelium in all the places where we work, so that compassionate systems change becomes a more likely outcome. This is how we try to change the structure. I'm now going to look at how much time I've spent. Are there any questions so far? Is it kind of clear? Yeah? I should wear my sunglasses.
Yeah, Mette, you have a very distinguished colleague at MIT, Noam Chomsky, who's 95 years old. Unfortunately, he experienced a stroke. But besides that, he is the most quoted living person in the world.
Is he really?
And some time ago, he wrote a book with Herman about the mass media titled Manufacturing Consent. Now, I'm wondering if Chomsky might write a book about education as manufacturing consent. So does education, while it has the potential to introduce some subversive ideas, does it by and large function as a hegemonic institution? And just another point, Marx, who's a favorite scholar of mine too, wrote back in the 19th century that capitalism is a metabolic rift with nature. So I interject those comments into your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I can't know if Noam Chomsky will write another book, and if so, if it'll be about education. But I hold him in very high regard, so thank you for evoking his name in the space. I do think that some of the ways in which we have internalized what it means to be a living human being in our time is, often labeled as internalized capitalism. We can call it whatever we want, for my part, but for me, it represents the old structure. And here's what I know about this. I know that over the last couple of 100 years, extremely well-educated people have made all the decisions in the world, mainly men. I'm not out for bashing men, I'm just stating facts, have made all the decisions that have led us to this point where we are today. if that's the outcome of education, then something profoundly needs to change. Because if these are the outcomes of what the most well-educated, powerful people can make decisions about, then we're missing out on something entirely. So that at least is how I'll respond to that in this situation. So what we're doing with this mycelium is we have a model for systems change. And I can't tell you how many rants about what people call systems change. And I will spare you because that would add an extra hour to this lecture. But you know, the people who get the most funding usually have like the 7 ways of changing the system, and then you check the box, and then that's supposed to be systems change. Last year, the Carnegie Corporation called me. They've been funding some of our work, very minimally so, thinking about what they were able to do, but they've been funding a lot of systems change initiatives over the years. And they called me and they asked, so we've been funding systems change for the last couple of decades, and we haven't actually seen any systems change as outcomes. And I was like, I have an idea about why. And the idea that I have about why is we forget to take the inner part of change into the equation. We simply do not know enough about what it means to be a human being who needs to change in order to generate the changes that we want to see in the world, and that's what it means to live the systems change. So what we're doing is we have this model, which is an organic model for studying systems change. The field that we're studying are the seeds that we're kind of planting for compassionate systems change, and we know something about those seeds. We can't know the outcomes. So that whole kind of backward planning from in 5 years it needs to look like this, we can't know what it'll look like because COVID happens or some climate event or something or other. But we can know which seeds we're planting, and we can know what they need for nourishing. And the portals into that, the nourishment, comes through, on the one hand, capacity building. Capacity building basically means people need to learn new things in order to be able to operate differently. That's what we do through our Center for Systems Awareness. We train people basically in the compassionate systems framework. That's a lot of what it takes. But it's not enough. People go to great professional developments all the time, and then they come back and they're like, yes, I'm going to do all this, and then nothing really happens. Has that ever happened to any of you who've tried that? And then after a while, it becomes a kind of an afterthought, and sometimes it produces resignation because it was actually really something we would have liked to do, but there's just no means to do it. So practice and putting practical applications into work is like, how are we doing it? How am I utilizing these tools and practices and so on into the practical setting that I'm in? And that's, you know, a continuous process, obviously. But in order to do that well, there has to be a community of practitioners coming together, and we have to have peer learning structures, because one person trying to create change might create change in your own kind of inner landscape, but not likely to produce change in the wider system. So community building is as important as all of it. And research, and this is research in the broadest sense, so not just the ivory tower research that we can do here at the University of Melbourne or at MIT, but also the personalized reflective capacities of human beings. What's working for me? What am I learning? How do I know it's working? What else needs to happen? How can I communicate this? And so on and so forth. So in a very broad kind of understanding of what our own reflective capacities can be. And that, of course, again, informs the capacity building, so that the more we learn about what's working and what's not working, we can refine our ways of doing our practices and refine our ways of evolving the capacity building segments and so on. So we're kind of putting that almost as a lens over the localities in which we're informing the change. So we're informing the change through those 4 portals. So right now, I'll give you an example. We work with counties in California. And a county oversees a couple of districts, or many districts sometimes, and in those districts there's a certain number of schools, and there's expanded learning, and there are local communities and parents and so on. So we try to kind of apply this lens, and then we infuse the field with these nutrients, if you will, for compassionate systems change. And the outcome, the vehicle that we're looking for, is producing consistently more and more generative social fields. I know this is a lot of jargony, technical language that for most of you probably will make no sense whatsoever. And this is why I was really intrigued by my 4.5-hour long lecture, because this is what I teach people usually. But generative social fields is the relational spaces we operate within. Part of how we've forgotten to human is that we've forgotten that we're one of the most social species on this planet, which means that consistently we're influenced by the people around us, and they in return influence us. If you've ever walked into a space where there was just people fighting and you can feel the intensity and energy there still, or you just came into a space where there had been some kind of breakdown or other, or you notice what happens when somebody randomly starts yelling at you. I don't know about you all, but my inclination is to yell back. Some people become really afraid, some start crying, so on and so forth. We consistently influence each other and our own emotional states and the way in which we relate to each other. The outcomes for us of a generative social field is a space that kids can come into. At the heart of education, in our view, should be generative social fields. Fields that allows you to grow. You feel seen and you feel heard, and there's a sense of kind of, I can be who I am and grow into the human being that I can become, not the cookie cutter approach and standardized learning and teaching to the test and all of that, but something that actually produces human flourishing. We cannot have access to all the billions of people on this planet, but we can more consistently create spaces in our systems of education that we actually have access to, where our kids spend the majority of their time, by the way, that are nourishing for human flourishing. And that's the outcomes that we're looking for, because this generative social fields for us are the vehicles for compassionate systems change. So that's what we're looking for in this methodology that we've developed. And just to make it very briefly, it has to do with the kind of the inner workings of the humans. So we used to talk about systems in humans, the cardiovascular system and central nervous system and so on and so forth. There's an emotional system also, and the emotional system we tend to prioritize. And at the same time, where do you think wars come from? Or art? Or urge to power, and so on. It's all driven by emotion. And as long as we keep overriding that as less important, we have to just remind ourselves that all what we call rational thinking is underpinned by emotions, by the way. That the emotions are primary, all thoughts are afterthoughts, so to speak. So it has to do with developing that sense of self, coming to understand who I am. It's not about making emotions go away, but understanding what they are as they show up, labeling what they, where they come from, understanding my own trigger points, my somatic markers, as Antonio Damasio calls them. And then how can I play into the relational fields that I'm in? How do I show up with you? How does it feel for you when I operate in this particular way? Who would I like to be as a human being? What intentionality am I bringing into the space? And that is, in fact, what creates our classrooms and our teams and our families and our schools, but also all the other institutions and organizations and society at large. So when we talk about systems, it's really assuming in and out of the very deep and personal out to the larger structures in place. And that's the entirety of the systems change that we're talking about. Without this in here, it's not going to change anything. So over the last couple of years, it's been pretty intensely pressing for me that this declining mental health and well-being of our children, that our children are suffering from all these extreme conditions that, in my view, no child should ever have to experience, and that's increasing so dramatically everywhere. I know some statistics from the US, and it's not pretty. The decade that led up to COVID, the suicide rates and suicide ideation of teenagers in the United States increased by 100%. We have to listen to that as feedback from the system. All we're doing right now is giving diagnosis, and then we're giving them pills and trying to ameliorate the conditions, instead of listening to this as the feedback from the most important and valuable parts of our living systems. Our little ones cannot live in the structures that we've created. And I know that some kids are thriving, and some kids have really great coping strategies, and some kids have all the support that they need. But if you take this seriously, how do you think they're influenced by all their peers and friends who are not thriving? The epidemics that come out of TikTok and Instagram of, people starving themselves or cutting themselves and so on and so forth, they're consistently transmitted in these social fields. So this cannot be a matter for education alone. Education has for too long been tasked with the well-being of kids. And it's just deeply unfair. I get to work with incredible, caring human beings that were never trained to deal with the amount of trauma and disconnect and dysfunctionality that they have to operate with today. And they are blamed and shamed by most of society for not getting it right with the kids, and it should not be a matter for education alone. We have to ally with our educators and make this a matter of society. Our kids are not thriving, that's a matter for all of us. It's a matter for the future of who we are as a species. And so we see all this fear and anxiety, depression, stress, suicide, and so on. Last year, a study was published in Nature with 10,000 kids from 10 different countries in the world, 1,000 of them from here in Australia. And the number one reason kids pointed to for their anxiety and depression was this climate change and all that covers of the uncertainty of the future. So I tried to create a causal loop diagram, right? We have all this climate change, we have extinction rates and loss of habitats. Extinction rates since 1970, approximately 73% of all species, of all the individuals of the species have died out. So the amount of each individual species that we have left is under critical pressure and more going extinct all the time. And you might say, well, that's happened over eons on this planet, and that is true. It's never happened at the rate it's happening right now. And let's be real, E.O. Wilson, the great evolutionary biologist, said, if humans go extinct, the planet will thrive and flourish probably after a couple of decades. If the insects go extinct, or even just the pollinators, it'll be a total chaotic mess, and it's unlikely that we'll be able to survive because this is critical for our food production. So we might think about ourselves as the most important beings on this planet, but I think if we take a kind of a planetary view on that, then probably the opposite is the case. And that creates, of course, all the floods, the drought, and the fires, and so on, and the ecosystems are collapsing, and it just generally creates an unsafe future. The extinction rates and the flooding and fires and all of that increases. All the pluses are how it increases hunger and poverty, increases migration, increases trauma and PTSD, which again feeds back, of course, to why our children are suffering and the unsafe future and so on. There's increasing resource scarcity. I don't know if anyone has noticed how much more olive oil and chocolate and so on costs today than it did just a couple of years ago. That is on the grow. That is probably one of the reasons for the outcome of the election that we're seeing right now in the United States. It's just really, really expensive to be alive if you want to be able to buy the same things. And pretty soon, probably at least with chocolate, it'll be pretty difficult to get your hands on. And that's destabilizing societies and increases the armament and the kind of the whole arms race. It increases the inequity and social injustice, creates more polarization. There is a greater likelihood for armed conflicts. I think we're sitting in the middle of that right now in the world. I know you are protected in some ways down here, down under. But from my vantage point, both in the United States, where I live in Boston, and in Denmark, where I also live, it looks pretty gloomy. And that decreases, the whole kind of polarization decreases our sense of resilience. And that increases our dissociation and numbness and overwhelm, which of course is feeding right into the fear, anxiety, depression, and so on. It also increases in-grouping, which means the polarization creates these in-groups. And of course, social media is really feeding into that. Our algorithms are constantly, feeding our in-grouping, which creates greater disconnect. And that means that we have less ability to take collective action. And when we're taking less collective action, nothing happens with the climate change, and we lose a sense of hope and belonging. And that increases the declining mental health and well-being of our children. Key leverage point I put down here. Key leverage point for me to see here is what we will focus on working on going forward. When this cannot be tasked to education alone, we have to really work on figuring out how can we leverage this. These are, reinforcing loops. They're causal loop diagrams, and they're all reinforcing, and they're vicious cycles. This is a dynamic that keeps perpetuating itself, and it has done for decades, if not longer. So if destabilized society are a key leverage point, the way that I would like to just address this is, we all heard this. Everybody calls it an African proverb, never said anything about which country it came from, and I can never see the source of it anywhere, but let's just call it the African proverb. It takes a village to raise a child, because the sentiment is beautiful. But with this level of complexity, it takes a hell of a lot more than a village to raise a child. I'm sorry, but the world is way too complex and interconnected and globalized for us to think that villages, little small groupings of communities, can take care of this. My view is it takes at least a city, and it takes all the governance structures around those cities. So what I'd like to propose is that we create good ancestor cities. And I would like to see how we can work towards minimizing inequity and social injustice, not the kind of, oh, we're inclusive, that we usually see in those spaces, but out of a genuine understanding that we, the humans, are a social species. And that means that if you thrive and flourish, other people thrive and flourish, and then more of us thrive and flourish, so that when we're addressing social injustice and inequities, it's for all of us, not just for the people who are in the receiving end of the oppressive structures. And that means that it'll decrease the polarization. We'll be able to be in this together. One really important point here is that means together. It means, for me, way, way, way too much of this has been politicized. This was never about politics. Climate change should never have been about politics. The ecosystem collapses, and so this should never have been about politics at all. Politics has way too much power right now. We need people with all the diversity of opinions possible, because only then can we have the true and generative and creative forces needed for us to really produce these kinds of changes. So it'll decrease the polarization, decrease the in-grouping, and decrease the disconnect, and it'll increase resilience, which means that it'll decrease the dissociation, numbness, and overwhelm. It'll be easier for us to take collective action. We'll see more sense of hope and belonging. We can work on climate change locally, which is in fact where we can do stuff. Right now, we've been putting it on the individuals for too long. Oh, you're taking flights around the world. Look, that is not leverageable. It's about how we want, can you imagine what it would be like living in a city where there was a commitment to taking care of the unborn generations? That we want clean drinking water, we want fresh air, we want to make sure that everything is recycled and regenerated in a good way. We want to make sure that we preserve the topsoil, that we're able to sustain our own kind of production of food, and we take care of our elders. When you go down to the government structure, I don't know what it's like here, but most places in most of the countries I've been, today I actually had an interesting encounter here in Melbourne because my car had been towed away. I would say that, oh my God, that's such a surprise, but it's really not, because I'm really, really bad at rules, and they put rules and little signs, and I can't really process what it says. I'm just like, oh, there are other cars standing here, mine can stand here as well. And when I came down this morning, my car was no longer there. Fortunately, I've been in this similar situation many places around the world over the years. So I immediately went up, car towing Melbourne, what happened? And took an Uber to the place where I could get my car back. I was trying to chat up the guy because they had a little sign saying that most people get yelled at all the time and that's unfair. So I was like, I'll be the good guy today. And he was just not at all acceptable to being chatted up. He thought I was the weirdest alien he'd ever encountered, that's for sure. So I amused myself in that space. But it's usually like that, right? It becomes extremely transactional when we are in contact with healthcare systems or daycare systems and so on and so forth. Individuals can be beautiful and lovely and so on, but the transactionality deprives us something of humanness. So imagine living in a space where that was the commitment, not what kind of political stance do you have, not what kind of religion do you have, not whatever else you believe in or what food you eat, and you don't have to be a vegan and all of that. Basically, we want to be good human beings that has a dignified way of operating with each other, where we can come together over our differences and we can still have acceptance and love and care, because that's an intention we're setting for how we can also be together on this planet. I want to live there. And I'm imagining that for cities like that, the kinds of people that they would attract, if we could really pull that off, would be amazing. This could be very, very leverageable for change. And we could help minimizing the collapse of the ecosystems. We know the sad thing about this, and the saddest thing about being a scientist is we know everything it takes. We have all the information to what it takes to have regenerative ecosystems, to minimize climate change, to create healthy water systems, and so on and so forth. We're just not doing it collectively. But we can if we're enough people, and there's still boundary conditions about what that needs. We would minimize resource scarcity, minimize hunger and poverty, minimize migration, and it would really increase, the likelihood that more cities would join in on becoming these good ancestor cities. And most of all, of course, it would help us decreasing the suffering of our kids, because it no longer takes a village, it takes a city, it takes enough people to really be committed to looking at how can we help invest in our future as a species, invest in our little ones, and not just my own, but all the ones that they're going to love and play with and fight with and do stuff with and live with. They're in that as well, because otherwise mine can't thrive. So this is a matter for all of us. And that is basically what our next move will be at the Center for Systems Awareness, and I would love to figure out how to study the impacts of this. I think if we're many enough and we could really elevate this as a strategy, I have a hunch that there are more people on this planet who would rather live this way than the current trajectory we're looking at right now. We just have to make it available to people. And so I don't know if that'll decrease our need for weapons, because it might become extremely attractive and something has to protect it. That's a huge issue that I just don't really know how to talk about and think about. And the likelihood for armed conflicts, will it be a threat? Will it be a sanctuary where we know we're taking care of kids, so people will create neutrality? I don't know. Somebody else will need to really think out the strategies for that. And upcoming opportunities. Hey, next week I'm doing an intro workshops here in Melbourne, and we can have late registrations if anybody wants to. You'd be more than welcome to. This is an introduction to the Compassionate Systems Framework. We have our annual Systems Awareness Lab Conference at MIT in January. It's also open for registrations. And then we have another introductory workshop that I run with Peter Senge, another famous and esteemed guy from MIT. I'm not supposed to call him old, but I do sometimes. Anyway, sorry, I'm being recorded. I meant older, Peter. I'm sorry. And we lead twice a year one of our foundational programs. And this one is hybrid, so you can attend virtually as well. Just wanted to make that available to you. All right, I think that's it for now.
So I'd now like to invite up Professor Dianne Vella-Brodrick, who will finish off our evening.
Thank you so much, Mette. You encouraged us to look beyond isolated events and experiences and into the heart of our real and shared experiences of life and education to create positive change using a compassionate systems framework. I'll be honest, at first I found the idea of compassionate systems to be an oxymoron. How many would agree? When you think about systems, they can be so rigid and impersonal and almost incompatible with the warmth and empathy we associate with compassion. But thanks to your work and insights, Mette, I see now how compassion can be the very essence that binds a system, enabling it to come together to respond to needs and change with awareness, adaptability and care. I'm deeply grateful for your vision, your courage and work, and most importantly for your very generous spirit in sharing some of this with us today and in such a heartful way. And I must say, I'll never look at a mushroom in the same way, so thank you for instilling that and thank you for a great talk today. I also would like to thank those involved in preparing for this event today. So Yvette and Rachel, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the Dean for enabling this activity to take place and the drinks and nibbles and everything. So it's a great opportunity now. I'd like to invite the Dean of the Faculty of Education, Professor Jim Watterston, to present a small gift to thank you for the lecture for this evening. So over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Dianne, and thank you, Rachel. That was a really wonderful introduction today, and if I'd seen you do that before, I would have banned you from doing it, because after 7 years, I can see what I could aspire to. You were absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I didn't mean to come and speak today, Mette, so I really did want to come and listen, and I'm really absolutely enthralled by what you were talking about. It's fantastic, so I don't want to give another review, so thank you, Dianne. I just want to thank you for what you brought to the table today, and it's on a day that I feel quite dark about, quite frankly, from what I've seen, and thinking about compassionate structures is something that you might have to think about. It's starting in the White House, I think. It is going to be a challenging period for us, and I think your work is going to be required more than ever. So you've brought a deep shining light on what was otherwise a disappointing day. So I wanted to thank you so much and really appreciate what you've brought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.